In this lecture, I plan to deal with Alexander's relationship with his Greek allies, particularly the period between, say, 331 BC and Alexander's death in 323 BC. The relationship of Alexander and his Greek allies was all important. While the Macedonians provided the military power that enabled Alexander to conquer the Persian Empire, the Greeks provided not only military power, but much of the financial and technical expertise in Alexander's army. The whole engineering corps of the Macedonian army were essentially Greek emigres. Alexander also depended on the Greeks for a number of services. The court was filled with Greek specialists. These included men who would map out the geography of the Persian Empire. Some of them were now Macedonians, but they were Greek emigres, such as Nearchus. And finally, Alexander himself really regarded himself in the widest sense as a member of that Greek cultural community. He spoke Attic Greek most of the time. He could speak Macedonian, and by all accounts, that was not understood by the Greeks, but he probably preferred to speak Attic Greek. His mother was Greek. He was a descendant of Achilles. He worshipped essentially the gods of Greece, the gods of Olympus. And so the relationship with the Greeks had powerful cultural connections as well as military implications. Therefore, in ordering his empire in the final years of his life, in 324 and 323 BC, the administering of the Greek allies, most of them in the League of Corinth, was one of the most daunting problems in creating an effective world empire. The Persians could be ruled through their traditional institutions. Alexander played the role of the traditional king of Macedon vis-a-vis his Macedonian veterans, but the Greeks required far more careful handling. It is my opinion that Philip II understood how to cope with the Greeks far better than Alexander. But then Philip's ambitions were far less. They were essentially confined to the Aegean world. Philip himself had spent 3 formative years at the city of Thebes, and he understood how the Greeks held very, very much as cherished ideals the notion of autonomy and freedom. He autonomia kai he eleutheria. That is, every city-state living under its own laws as passed by the citizens, and the freedom of every city-state to conduct its own affairs without outside interference. Philip had constructed that League of Corinth to accommodate these notions as much as possible and yet secure control of the Greeks indirectly so that Philip could draw upon their talents for his Asian expedition. Alexander had only very briefly conferred with the Greek allies in 336 and 335 BC. And after 334 BC, he never returned to Greece. His dealings with the Greeks were through intermediaries. First and foremost was the regent Antipater, who ran Macedon in Alexander's absence and waged a constant war of letters with Olympias. Olympias hated Antipater, and Antipater and Olympias were constantly sending letters to Alexander accusing each other of undermining the other's authority. He also dealt with various Greeks at court who were guest friends of Alexander or companions. They were enrolled among the hetairoi, or people who were politically linked to Alexander, that is, their government was backed by the Macedonian monarchy, and they spoke for their cities vis-a-vis Alexander. So that Alexander was really dealing with his Greek allies quite indirectly. After 334 BC, as Alexander's army presses east, he has less and less contact with Greek cities. The cities of Asia Minor had been liberated, and they were enrolled as allies vis-a-vis Alexander. They were not made members of the League of Corinth. There were Greek cities on Cyprus and in Cyrene. Those would be the colonies in eastern Libya today. They too had independent alliances with Alexander the king, and Alexander didn't visit any of these cities. So when Alexander returned from India in late 325 BC, he had had very little contact with Greeks for over 10 years, certainly not in Greece, and his relationship with the Greeks was really rather complicated at this point. I mentioned earlier in this course, when Alexander crossed into Asia, there were still many Greeks who had hoped that Darius would win. These included the radical Democrats at Athens, Hyperides, Demosthenes, and their supporters. They had never been reconciled to Macedonian rule, and at the outset of the expedition of Alexander, they had high hopes that the Macedonian army would simply be swallowed up in the depths of Asia. The other city-state that had a great deal of resentment to Alexander and was actively negotiating with King Darius III was Sparta. The Spartans had not fought at Chaeronea in 338 BC, not for any love of Macedon, but because they were not in command of the allied forces. They had stayed out of the rebellion of Thebes in 335 BC, again, because they were not the leaders of the projected coalition. It would be a Theban-Athenian alliance, which essentially fell apart when Alexander appeared so suddenly. The Spartans, however, were unrepentant, and they had a good deal of resources at their disposal. To be sure, the defeats they suffered at the hands of the Thebans had diminished Spartan power. The Spartans controlled only directly Laconia, that is the southeastern section of the Peloponnesus. They had lost Messenia. But they still commanded allies and friendships across Peloponnese and central Greece. There were many exiles at Sparta ready to turn their cities over to a Spartan king who could prove himself charismatic. And there was such a king. His name was Agis III. Agis III spent much of his time negotiating with the Persians to engineer a coalition of Greek city-states and raise a rebellion in Greece that would defeat Antipater and force Alexander to return to Greece. The hope was that the Persians would bankroll this. And in the first 2 years of the war, 334, 333 BC, it looked like Agis III could pull this off. He was able to recruit numerous mercenaries among the Dorian cities of Crete. The main port of Laconia, Tainarum, became a major mercenary market. Agis also received mercenaries from Darius III. The Spartans actually put their army out on loan on occasions, fighting in places like Egypt and southern Italy to get money. There had been a reform of the Spartan army, and Agis was ready to go. The problem was that Alexander moved too quickly. A revolt planned in 333 BC never came off because the Persians pulled out of the Aegean, recalled their forces, and the news came that Alexander had won the Battle of Issus. When the Battle of Gaugamela was fought in 331 BC, Agis at that point had staged a revolt. The news had gotten back to Greece. I had read that passage earlier from Diodorus Siculus, that Darius had been defeated at Gaugamela, and many of the Greeks had despaired that they could ever defeat the Macedonians, but the Spartans had moved. Agis had raised the standard of revolt. He was joined only by a small number of allies. The Thebans and Athenians were not about to get involved. The Thebans had been severely punished. Their city was still in ruins. The Corinthians stayed aloof, and they had been traditional allies of the Spartans. The Athenians, even under democratic leaders such as Demosthenes, had no love for Sparta. And so most of the leading states stood aside. Antipater quickly raised an enormous army of mercenaries, called out the Macedonian levy, and with an army of over 40,000 strong, descended upon the Peloponnesus and defeated and slew Agis at Megalopolis, that is the capital of the Arcadian Federal League, which had been founded under Theban auspices. The defeat and death of Agis, which apparently was about the same time as the Battle of Gaugamela, perhaps shortly afterwards, ended any hope of a Greek rebellion, war of independence in Alexander's lifetime. Sparta was enrolled in the Hellenic League, and the Greek city-states remained quiet until Alexander's return from the east in 324 BC. So when Alexander was in a position to order his empire in late 325 and early 324 BC, there was no question of the relationship between Alexander and his Greek allies. The Macedonian king clearly had the superior position. He had been deferential in his early years. He had waged the initial stages of the expedition as a pan-Hellenic war. But that was over after 330 BC, when he had dismissed his allies. He had gone out of his way to rebuild major sanctuaries. He offered money to cities such as Priene and Ephesus to rebuild their great temples or to improve them. He ordered the founding or the refounding of the city of Smyrna. And he acted in many ways as a Philhellene king, a benefactor, a foreign king who was friendly to Greek cities, although culturally in many ways Alexander was a Hellene. But that was not enough. Alexander still had to come up with some type of solution of dealing with these city-states, and he was hindered by the arrangements that his father had framed. The League of Corinth corresponded to federal organizations that had at least 100 years' history behind them. Furthermore, in 337 BC, when the League of Corinth had been established, and then when Alexander again was elected as commander after his father's death, on those occasions a general peace had been proclaimed. That is a koine irene, and that meant that all the signatories of the Hellenic League were legitimate governments, that their freedom and autonomy was guaranteed, that Alexander could not arbitrarily intervene in the affairs of these states, and above all, any kind of outstanding disputes, territorial and otherwise, were to be adjudicated by mediators, probably someone like the priest of Delphi or one of the international shrines could be called in as an honest broker. Alexander was facing a pressing problem not only in dealing with the Greek cities, what would my future relationship be governing through the Sanhedrin, but also in satisfying the demands of his numerous Greek mercenaries and his army. In 324 BC, Alexander not only had to dismiss his Macedonian veterans, he had thousands of Greeks on his hands. And by one report, there were over 20,000 of them ready to return home. They had done their service. They had fought with Alexander for years. There were also numerous Greek forces that had been in the command of Alexander's garrison commanders and the satraps. They were dismissed in the reordering of the empire. So Alexander had on hand numerous Greeks in his service to be returned home. Antipater kept sending reports back from Greece that something had to be done to work out arrangements with the Greek city-states. There was always this undercurrent of resentment. Harpalos, the treasurer of Babylon, had absconded with 6,000 talents and 5,000 Greek mercenaries and made his way to Athens. And his presence in the Greek world incited many of the anti-Macedonian elements to consider a war against Alexander. This was voiced in Athens, where Hyperides and the radical Democrats, when Harpalos initially appeared, argued, well, let's take him in. He's got an army, he's got money, we can stage a revolt. Even Demosthenes was sensible enough to reject Harpalos, but Harpalos made his way to the mercenary base in Peloponnesus, contacted a Greek mercenary commander, an Athenian actually by birth, Leosthenes, and attempted to cooperate with Leosthenes in carrying out some kind of harebrained rebellion against Alexander. And this was all in 324 BC. So there were incidents in Greece. There was the problem of settling the Greek mercenaries. There's a long-standing question of what is the relationship to be of this great conqueror, this Macedonian king, and these Greek allies who, while very important in the administering of this empire, proved extremely difficult to govern because they were tied to these notions of freedom and autonomy. I argued in a previous lecture that part of the way out of this was to promote that idea of divine destiny and honors. This could assist in Alexander finding at least a place within the Greek political ideology, that he's a figure outside the polis, he's not really a tyrant, he's such a great figure that he'll become a god, and that he and his successors have this sort of divine aura that exempts them from the usual laws of the polis. And that would help to some extent. But then there was the practical day-to-day running of relationships between Alexander and the Greeks, and this is where Alexander stumbled. And he made mistakes which I'm not sure Philip would have made, but then, in fairness to Alexander, Philip didn't face the problems that Alexander did. Ironically, and it seems odd to us as moderns, whatever the appeals were in the Greek world to vote Alexander divine honors, this is not what really alienated the Greeks. It did evoke some insulting and contemptuous remarks by Alexander's foes in Athens and in Sparta, and the Spartans, in their traditional way, made a spoof of the whole thing. But on the whole, most of the Greek cities probably passed these honors without too many problems. There were long-standing traditions for this. The issue that really galvanized the Greeks was rather the exiles decree, or the exiles edict, as it's sometimes called. This was announced at the Olympic Games in July of 324 BC, and it was announced after various Greek city-states had decided to vote Alexander some type of divine honors and send embassies to Alexander. What the exiles decree was an attempt by Alexander to solve part of his problems with the army. And that is some 20,000 Greek mercenaries who had been in his service, along with other political exiles at court, were allowed to return home to their Greek city-states. These exiles included many mercenaries, but it also included many men who had gotten into political disputes with their fellow citizens and sought a military career, essentially as soldiers of fortune, in Alexander because politically they had been ruined or exiled at home. Justin, who wrote the Epitome in the late 2nd, early 3rd century A.D., based on the account of Pompeius Trogus going back to, and that's a Latin account of the kings of Macedon going back to Greek sources of the 4th century B.C., Justin, in his Latin Epitome, caught clearly what was going on. This is what he writes. While these events were in progress in the East, that's all of Alexander's successes, in Greece, the Athenians and the Aetolians are a Greek tribal people living in West Greece today, along the shores of the Corinthian Gulf, with their full strength prepared for war to which they were already moving while Alexander was still alive. The causes of the war were: Alexander, when he returned from India, sent letters to Greece by which the exiles of every state, except those condemned of murder, and murder was seen as a pollution. It was a religious crime, and it was usually treated that way. If you had murdered a fellow citizen, all bets are off. But anything else is okay here. Be restored. These letters, which were recited when all of Greece was present at the Olympic Games, that is the great Pan-Hellenic festival, and we know that took place in July of 324 BC, provoked a great uproar, lest the restored exiles would become more powerful in the state, because many of them had been expelled from their homeland not by any laws, but rather due to the factional politics among the political leaders. The Latin term there is principes, and this is more or less equivalent to the political classes of the Greek world. In the 5th century BC, they would be known as the koloi kagathoi, and Justin is translating from the Greek, and what he's referring to is stasis. That is the factional politics that pit citizens against each other. This is a traditional clash in a Greek city-state. In the 4th century BC, this would usually pit oligarchs against democrats, and that many of the exiles in Babylon, in Susa, in Alexander's army, were essentially political outs. They could have been oligarchs or democrats, depending on the circumstances of the city. Alexander was going to pay these men off. He was going to restore them to their homeland. Now, that immediately signaled an alarm. All of the Greeks grew very troubled about this. Furthermore, there are apparently several secondary issues relevant to several of the leading states. The Athenians had established a clericy on the island of Samos, which is still one of the most beautiful islands in the Aegean. And this was an Athenian colony. That is, Athenians were settled on this island and they retained their citizen rights. And this colony had been established during the period of the Second Athenian Confederacy, and in 337 BC, the Athenians were confirmed in the possession of their clericies, and above all, the clericies in the North Aegean, and the Athenian administration of the shrine of Apollo on the island of Delos. All the other Athenian allies of the Second Confederacy, those alliances were dissolved, and all of those states were enrolled as independent city-states in the Hellenic League. But Athens held on to their vital clericies, particularly Samos, and also the control of the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos. And these were very important to the Athenians. Well, Alexander apparently sent a letter or a supplement to that decree that this was now to be questioned, that there were numerous Samian exiles in Alexander's service. They were to be returned to Samos, and inevitably that would raise questions whether Samos was Athenian or Samian. There would be, at the very least, lawsuits lodged by the exiles returning and claiming that we want our property back. And this is inevitable. When exiles return from a very long absence, very often they think they're simply going to walk home, find the homes the way they were, and everything will return the way before it was when the Athenians came in or whoever else had dispossessed them. The same was issued to the Aetolians, who were 3 tribal peoples in western Greece, united in a league, a federal league. Various towns they had acquired in Acarnania, a region well known to students of the Peloponnesian War on the Gulf of Ambracia. These towns were now to be liberated because the exiles, the Acarnanians, We're going to return. Remember that one of Alexander's physicians, Philip of Acarnania, came from that region. This, to all Greeks, was a direct violation of freedom and autonomy. It caused an uproar. I think Alexander's supporters, and these included some very powerful men, had difficulty, at least in the major cities, convincing assemblies that they really had no choice but to agree to these arrangements. And as I noted, it was far less controversial to give these divine honors to Alexander than to accept these political decrees from Alexander. For what did it foretell? It foretold that to the Greeks, the king of the Macedonians could legislate at his will by edict the affairs of the cities of the Hellenic League. And it was also probably a bit disturbing that Alexander, as he liberated Greek cities, tied them individually to himself by treaty rather than enrolled them in this federal league of the Greeks. And so the Greeks had very good cause to be alarmed. Alexander was now the master of the world as they understood it. Would he become ever more impatient with dealing with his Greek allies? Would he be issuing orders rather than persuading his Greek allies? Ironically, these sensibilities among the Greeks, and particularly among the Athenians, who took the lead in organizing the last really serious Greek revolt against Macedonian rule, we call this the Lamian War, and it breaks out just after Alexander's death in 320, and it goes down from 323 to 322 BC. The Athenians were particularly sensitive to these issues. When Alexander marched east in 334 BC, he imposed a peace on the Greek world. Few of the Greek city-states had answered the appeal of Agis III. The Athenians had stood out of any kind of opposition to Alexander. Now, there are several embarrassing incidents where Athenian envoys are captured at the court of King Darius III, and Alexander just tells them, you know, it's very naughty, you shouldn't do that, and go home. But on the whole, the Athenians had remained quiet. The leading figure in Athens at this time was a man named Lycurgus, a very common Greek name, not to be confused with the legendary reformer of Sparta. And he dominated Athens in the 10 years of Alexander's conquests of Asia. He was put in charge of Athenian finances. That is, he succeeded at the position of Eubulus in the earlier 4th century BC, and he restored Athenian finances so that by the time of the outbreak of the Lamian War in the summer of 323 BC, Athens was drawing an annual revenue of 1,200 talents a year. The Athenians had never had so much money since the mid-5th century BC. At the same time, there was a reorganization of the hoplite instructions, particularly for the Ephi base, the men between 18 and 20 years of age. And by 323 BC, there are well over 10,000 Athenians on the hoplite rolls. Athens also continued to maintain her navy. These are the traditional triremes. Now, it is still a question to be studied. The Athenians had perhaps some 200 or 180 triremes ready to go at the outbreak of the war. On the other hand, the Athenians had neither the resources nor the need to update their navy because there were new ships that were appearing on the seas. These are particularly the quinqueremes, and the quinquereme was an expanded warship rowed by some 300 men rather than 180 men. And the quinquereme achieved this by doubling up on the men rowing on the lower and middle banks of oars. That is, it had 3 banks of oars, but the lower and intermediate one had 2 men on the oar rather than 1 man on the oar. The ships were far more powerful. They had much greater ramming capacity. They were also more seaworthy. Now, these are expensive vessels to build, and Alexander, who captured the Cypriot and Phoenician ports, well, he had access to these ships because they had been built on orders of the great king of Persia and later of Alexander. And Athens just apparently didn't have the means to keep up with this arms race. And so they found themselves at a disadvantage. They didn't have quinqueremes or these stronger warships at the outbreak of the Lamian War. They had very few quinqueremes, if any, in service. Nonetheless, the Athenians had made an enormous comeback since Chaeronea. They had military resources, they had money, they had a confidence. All of this as a result of the fact that they had been left largely on their own. Antipater had asked very little from them. And so when this exiles decree arrives from Alexander in the summer of 324 BC, the Athenians are in no mood to accept these types of orders. They actually see themselves as having made a comeback. And figures such as Demosthenes continue to occupy an important position in the assembly, and Demosthenes was never reconciled to Macedon. He didn't join the Spartans because he disliked the Spartans, and he was no lover of the Macedonians at all. The result is in 324 BC, when this exile's degree is announced, there is resentment in the Greek world, and Harpalus, who had been mucking around in Athens and then at the mercenary ports, Harpalus eventually ends up getting killed in Crete. He was readmitted to Athens in 323 BC. There were charges of bribery. There was uncertainty what happened to all the money he brought, and Demosthenes was actually accused of taking bribes, but nothing was really proved. When the news came of Alexander's death in June of 323 BC, the Athenians were ready to go. They had money, they had annual reserves, they had some money from Harpalus, and above all, Harpalus had done a service to Athens. He had put the Athenians in touch with the Athenian mercenary commander, Leosthenes, who put 8,000 mercenaries from the Peloponnesus at Athenian disposal. The Aetolians immediately joined. And some of the lesser states cheered the Athenians on, but, we're not willing to send forces, and this is typical of all these coalitions. But the Athenians and Aetolians raised the standard of rebellion. They repudiated their membership in the League of Corinth. At this point, Alexander is dead. The generals in Asia are having a major discussion on what follows next, and there are some 10,000 to 15,000 Macedonian veterans marching towards Greece under the command of Craterus. These are the men dismissed at Opus. Antipater reacted with his usual energy. He raised an army and marched into Thessaly, where he met the Athenian force. The Thessalians immediately deserted to the Athenians, and the Aetolians joined the insurgents. Antipater was driven into the city of Lamian, which is a Thessalian city, and put under siege. The Athenian mercenary commander, Leosthenes, is killed in a skirmish, and without his command, there were some real problems. But the Greeks had failed to reckon on the enormous power of the Macedonian monarchy, even though Alexander was absent. Immediately, an imperial fleet with many quinquiremes is launched under the command of Clitus the White. This is a different Clitus, a younger officer who appears with a fleet of 240 ships, and they simply sweep the Athenians off the sea in 322 BC. The Athenian navy just can't match this imperial force raised from the great eastern ports. Furthermore, reinforcements came pouring in. First, Leonatus arrived with forces, raised the siege of Lamian, and was killed in the action, much to the delight of Antipater, because Leonatus was seen as an ally of Olympias, and Olympias, of course, hated Antipater, and we'll get into that in a later lecture. And then Craterus arrived with enormous forces from Asia, well over 10,000 veterans, and at the plain outside of Chronon in Thessaly, the Macedonian veterans crushed the Greek forces, the Thessalians, Aetolians, and Athenians. The last serious effort to challenge Macedonian rule went down in complete defeat, and Antipater was in no mood to be generous. The League of Corinth was dissolved. Macedonian garrisons were put into the key cities, particularly at Lamia, at Chalcis, at the Piraeus in Athens, and the citadel of Corinth, known as the Acrocorinth. These came to be known as the fetters of Greece. That is, the garrison positions in Greece that maintain a Macedonian overlordship. And the Macedonians would hold on to those positions down until 196 BC, when the Romans had defeated the Macedonians and expelled those garrisons. In addition, Athens was severely treated. The democracy was abolished. A property qualification was imposed. I believe the account of Diodorus Siculus that something like 22,000 Athenians or 21,000 Athenians were disenfranchised. There were only 9,000 active citizens who had high property class. Various democratic leaders were executed. Demosthenes committed suicide in the aftermath of the defeat. But even others who were favorable to Macedonian rule were compromised. Phocion, the old conservative general who served 45 times as general of Athens, negotiated the terms and was criticized for it very unfairly. The result is that the proud and resentful Greek cities were now to be put under a Macedonian overlord. This was the result of the exile's decree. Alexander had set in motion before his death a series of events in which the League of Corinth was dissolved, and as a result, Philip of Macedon and his arrangements were seen as the ideal measure against which the Macedonian king or overlord should be judged. And for the rest of the Hellenistic period, down to 196 BC, the Greeks ever resented the control of the Macedonian king. They ever saw that king as a foreign conqueror. They were never reconciled. And in the end, it was these Greek city-states, particularly the Aetolians and the Athenians, the ones who had raised the banner of rebellion in 323 BC, who summoned in Rome to destroy the Macedonian king. It was tactically brilliant and diplomatically one of the most foolish moves ever made, because the Greeks exchanged a mistress for a master.